Okay, let's look at chapter 13, how to reform so far, but only so far and not be stupid about it. It's a mild variation upon what we were looking at last time. We're still back in England, looking at the Reformation of England, and that's what we're going to do here. We start off with the dissolution of the monasteries. We move on to Thomas Cromwell. This is part of the unpopularity of the monasteries enables the king to get things moving. One of the ideas apparently was to nationalise the church, but that would lead to other problems that we looked at in the last session in the notes on being a sort of civil servant. Thomas Cromwell comes into it, and he manages to break up the small ones. He moves on to the big ones and starts to get working on them. Thomas Cranmer, who becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury. He's the main man who writes the Book of Common Prayer. So he's the man that we are grateful to for his work on Matins and Evensong and our BCP communion. I was going to present him symbolically as a wife in a box, because he was talking with the king about how can we get this Reformation thing going for you, how can we help you with your divorces, and he was looking at this idea of going over to Europe, and he goes over, he does his sort of sabbatical research, and he comes back with some ideas and a wife, but he's not allowed to be married, and so the poor girl ends up travelling everywhere in a cardboard box on the back of his coach, and so it's one of those sort of fairly open secrets that the Cranmer was married, but he's not allowed to be publicly married at this point. You've got stuff here about his vows, stuff here about the BCP and how it moves. This concept of being a North Ender is quite good. If I just use this box but turn it into an altar for a moment instead, okay, there's your altar. Most of the altars are like this, with me standing behind it and doing communion. But in those days there was another way of doing communion, which is where the priest stands with his back to you and you can't see anything of what it is that he's getting up to. So what the plan was, this is under Edward now, the plan was to take your altar and move it into the congregation so that the priest would then stand to the side and do everything, and the people would sort of gather around. Very nice way of doing communion. Now later on, when the altar gets moved back against the altar, there's a whole bunch called North Enders, and they continued to be at the north end of the altar, so they would continue to be here rather than here or here. One of my churches, the altar is really stuck up against the wall, so there's nothing you can do in terms of getting behind it, and I don't really like this, so I tend to be a North Ender for the communion services that I do in this church. So it continues to happen. You've got stuff here about the black rubric. I hope you follow that. I found it a little tricky myself, getting my head around there. And then, of course, moving on to Bloody Mary. But no, I haven't bought my tomato juice, but that was the obvious symbol there for her. Stuff about Bloody Mary, and finally about Cranmer and his martyrdom. And then the Elizabethan settlement. The Elizabethan settlement is about the Act of Supremacy, the Act of Uniformity, and it was about trying to get the Church of England to be one in their understanding of who we are. Some good stuff tucked away in here. And you've got the beginnings of the poem and the last stanza of The Vicar of Bray, which is a brilliant poem about just trying to accommodate to the political atmosphere as things change all the way through the time. I was actually going to skip past this Oxford University section at the top of page 28 and move into how the Pope speaks bull at the bottom of page 28. This is the Pope's declaration of regnans in excelsis. Really not helpful for the Pope to call Queen Elizabeth a servant of wickedness, and of course as he does so that gives you, a Roman Catholic, permission to not obey her. And that means, well, that means, are you a terrorist then? Are you a threat to the nation? So that then puts you in a sticky wicket. So actually, the Pope and his bull, that is a legal proper phrase for a thing that the Pope would actually issue. It's a bulla, is the old Latin, but it gets reduced to bull. To a papal bull. Luther burned the one that said, you're a heretic, and here is Elizabeth, and she's using this papal bull as a way of saying, you know, I'm right being this little bit Protestant, and I'm right not being quite sure about Roman Catholics, and so she uses it as a way of saying, come on chaps, we're all together in this. So that sort of thing works out very well for her in terms of how she uses it. She dies, she leaves no heir, and so, as I said a little while back, everything goes back up the line to Henry VIII, across to his sister Margaret, and then down to James VI of Scotland, who now becomes James I of England.